Alex Carver had always been the kind of person who preferred logic over emotion, structure over chaos, and preparation over impulse. It was how he had built his career, his financial stability, and ultimately the foundation for the life he had always envisioned for himself. When he finally purchased his dream home in a well-maintained, quiet suburban neighborhood, he believed he had made a calculated decision. The area was known for its peaceful atmosphere, strict property guidelines that kept the neighborhood aesthetically uniform, and above all, an apparent sense of order that kept potential disruptions at bay. He had done his research thoroughly, going through every regulation, ensuring that there were no hidden pitfalls, and confirming that his lifestyle would fit seamlessly into the community. But what he had failed to account for, what no amount of research could have prepared him for, was the relentless, insidious force that came in the form of his next-door neighbor, Karen Wilkins. Karen had lived in the neighborhood long before Alex had even considered moving in. From the very first day, she had established herself as a self-appointed guardian of community values, watching everything and everyone with the sharp scrutiny of someone who believed they had absolute authority. She was the type who seemed to exist purely to enforce unwritten rules, inserting herself into matters that didn't concern her, acting as though the neighborhood was her personal fiefdom. There were whispers among the other residents about how Karen had driven out previous homeowners through endless complaints and formal disputes, but few dared to openly confront her. Some called her difficult, others merely rolled their eyes and endured, but Alex quickly realized that Karen was far more than just an overbearing neighbor. She was someone who thrived on control, and more importantly, she despised anything that disrupted her rigid view of how things should be. The first time Alex met her, he had been in the middle of installing his high-capacity electric vehicle charging station in his driveway, something he had long planned and meticulously prepared for. It was a top-of-the-line system, allowing him to charge his car quickly and efficiently, and it was well within the legal guidelines of the neighborhood. He had acquired all the necessary permits, confirmed the boundaries of his property, and ensured that the station was installed in compliance with both municipal regulations and any guidelines that could potentially be enforced by the local community association. But before the final bolts had even been tightened, Karen had appeared, standing at the edge of her property with arms crossed, lips pursed, and an unmistakable air of disapproval. "You're really putting that thing up here?" she had asked, her tone a mixture of incredulity and condescension. Alex, who had encountered enough people like her in his professional life to recognize the warning signs of an impending nuisance, kept his response polite but firm. "Yes, I am. It's entirely within code." Karen had scoffed, shaking her head. "It's an eyesore. And do you really think that's safe? Those things catch fire, you know." Alex had learned long ago that arguing with people like Karen was a futile endeavor. Facts didn't matter to them, only their personal beliefs and whatever flimsy logic they could concoct to justify their outrage. He simply responded, "It's no different from any other electrical system, and if you have any concerns, you can check the regulations yourself. Everything is permitted." That was the moment he knew she wouldn't let it go. Over the next few weeks, Karen made it her mission to subtly, yet persistently, challenge his presence in the neighborhood. She would stand outside her house, glaring at the charging station whenever Alex used it. She casually mentioned to passing neighbors how some people just don't respect the aesthetic of the community anymore. On more than one occasion, he caught her staring at his property as if she were assessing how best to dismantle whatever small piece of independence he had carved out for himself. Alex, being pragmatic, ignored her as best he could. He had no interest in entertaining petty feuds. And as long as she kept her hostility limited to passive-aggressive behavior, he could tolerate it. But Karen wasn't the kind of person who settled for silent disapproval. She needed to win. And so when Alex woke up one morning to find his charging station completely destroyed, crushed under the weight of what was unmistakably a vehicle's tire marks, he knew exactly who was responsible before he even saw the evidence. The casing was shattered, the cables ripped apart, and deep grooves in the concrete of his driveway showed where a heavy vehicle had deliberately driven over it multiple times. The damage wasn't accidental. This wasn't a careless mistake or a freak incident. It was deliberate, calculated, and meant to send a message. As Alex stood there, Taking in the wreckage of his charging station, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, a familiar voice rang out from next door. "Well, would you look at that?" Karen said, her tone almost cheerful, but with a forced note of exaggerated concern. "That thing really wasn't built to last, huh?" Alex turned slowly, his expression carefully neutral, though every muscle in his body was coiled with restrained fury. Karen stood at the edge of her property, arms folded, watching him with an expression that was equal parts smug and feigned innocence. Before he could speak, she sighed dramatically and gestured toward her driveway, where her SUV sat parked, the front bumper suspiciously scuffed. "You know, actually, I was going to talk to you about something. I seem to have had a little accident last night. Your thing was just so close to the edge, and, well, these things happen." She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly. "You might want to think about being a little more considerate with where you put things in the future." Alex stared at her, barely able to believe what he was hearing. Not only had she destroyed his property, but she was now trying to frame it as his fault. Then she delivered the final blow. "And about my car," she continued, her voice adopting a saccharine sweet tone. "I'm sure you'll agree that since your station was in such an inconvenient place, you'll be the one covering the cost of my repairs. Fair is fair, after all." Alex exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. He had dealt with manipulative people before, but Karen had elevated it to an art form. There was no question in his mind now, this wasn't just about an inconvenience to her. This was about power. She wanted to push him, test his limits, see how far she could go before he either broke or gave in. But what Karen hadn't accounted for was that Alex wasn't the type to be intimidated. As he pulled out his phone, his jaw tightening, Karen's expression flickered just for a moment with something that almost resembled hesitation. Maybe she had assumed he would react differently. Maybe she thought he would back down, argue with her, or storm off in frustration. Instead, Alex simply said, "If you have any complaints, I suggest you file a police report. Because I will be." And with that, he walked inside, leaving Karen standing there, her smug expression slipping ever so slightly as she realized that this was far from over. Alex didn't waste time. He walked straight back into his house, took a deep breath to steady his frustration, and did what he always did when faced with a problem. He started gathering information. He took detailed photos of the damage, ensuring he captured every angle, from the deep tire grooves in the concrete to the shredded cables and cracked housing of the charging station. He zoomed in on the broken casing, noting the jagged edges and pressure marks, clear evidence that the damage had not been incidental. He then turned his attention to Karen's SUV. The scuff marks on her front bumper, the faint trace of paint transfer, and the way she had so quickly tried to shift blame all confirmed what he already knew: this was intentional. Before calling the police, he did a quick search on local property laws, confirming once again what he already knew. His charging station had been installed entirely within his property lines, and there was no regulation that prohibited its placement. He checked the permits he had acquired before installation and made sure he had digital copies saved and ready to present if needed. He wasn't going to give anyone, least of all Karen, any room to twist the situation in her favor. When he finally placed the call to the police, he kept his tone calm and measured, reporting the destruction of his property and requesting an officer to come document the damage. The dispatcher assured him someone would be sent out, but there was no telling how long it would take. In a town where more serious crimes demanded priority, this would likely be categorized as a minor dispute. He knew that if he wanted this to be taken seriously, he would have to ensure there was no room for ambiguity. 20 minutes later, he heard the sound of a police cruiser pulling up in front of his house. He stepped outside to greet the officer, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who introduced himself as Officer Bradley. Alex wasted no time, leading him straight to the scene. Bradley took a long look at the destroyed charging station, the tire marks, and the broken casing before letting out a low whistle. "That's some serious damage," Bradley muttered, crouching down to inspect the grooves in the driveway. "And you're saying you have reason to believe your neighbor was responsible?" Alex nodded. She admitted to hitting it. Claimed it was an accident, but the way she talked about it, I don't buy it. And if it was an accident, she wouldn't be trying to make me pay for her car repairs. Bradley raised an eyebrow. She's asking you to pay for her car. That's what she said, Alex confirmed. Claimed my charging station was inconsiderately placed and implied it was my fault for putting it there. Bradley shook his head and pulled out a notepad, jotting something down. That's not how that works. If it's on your property and properly installed, she has no case to make against you. The only question is whether this was truly an accident or a deliberate act. Alex hesitated for a brief second before saying, I don't have video proof, but given how vocal she's been about hating it, I have a hard time believing this was just a mistake. Bradley let out a slow breath, tapping his pen against the notepad. Yeah, proving intent is the tricky part. She'll probably just claim she didn't see it. As if on cue, Karen appeared from around the side of her house, wearing an expression of exaggerated surprise, as if she had just now noticed the officer's presence. Oh, what's all this, she asked, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I hope you're not wasting the officer's time with a silly little accident, Alex. Bradley turned to her, his expression unreadable. Ma'am, I need to ask you a few questions. Can you confirm whether you were responsible for damaging your neighbor's charging station? Karen let out a theatrical sigh and placed a hand on her chest. Oh, officer, I feel just awful about it. I really do. It was so dark last night, and you know how these electric things are so silent, so easy to miss. I barely tapped it, but I suppose these modern gadgets just aren't built very sturdy. Bradley gave her a long, level look. Ma'am, you barely tapped it, yet there are deep tire grooves in the driveway, and the station is completely destroyed. Karen's smile tightened. Well, I don't know what to tell you. It must have been weaker than I thought. Bradley glanced back at Alex before continuing, and why did you ask Mr. Carver to pay for the damage to your vehicle? Karen blinked, as if the question itself was absurd. Well, that's just common courtesy, isn't it? He put something in a place that caused damage to my property. Seems only fair that he takes some responsibility. Bradley exhaled through his nose, clearly losing patience. That's not how liability works, ma'am. The charging station was legally installed on his private property. You are responsible for maintaining control of your vehicle at all times. If you hit something on his land, the fault is yours, not his. Karen's expression flickered for the briefest moment, but she quickly composed herself, plastering on another sugary smile. Oh, officer, I'm sure we can handle this neighbor to neighbor. There's no need for unnecessary trouble. Bradley gave her a sharp look. That's not how this works either. Mr. Carver has every right to file a report for property damage. Karen's smile thinned. Well, that just seems excessive. We're neighbors, after all. No one likes a troublemaker. Alex, who had remained silent through most of the exchange, finally spoke. I don't like people destroying my property either. Karen pursed her lips. Fine. Do what you have to do. I'm sure the good officer has more important things to deal with than a little driveway mishap. Bradley ignored her and turned back to Alex. You want to press charges. Alex hesitated. He knew pressing charges could escalate things further, and while part of him wanted to make Karen pay for what she had done, he also knew she was the type of person who would retaliate in other ways. But if he let this go, it would only embolden her. Yes, he said finally. I do. Bradley nodded. All right, we'll document everything and move forward with the report. I'll also recommend that your insurance company take a look at this. They might be able to go after her for damages if it comes to that. Karen let out a sharp laugh. Insurance? Oh, please, let's not be dramatic. Bradley ignored her and turned back to Alex. I'll file the report and get you a case number. You might also want to consider getting some security cameras, just in case. Karen's eyes flickered at that. Alex didn't miss the way her fingers curled slightly, as if the idea of being watched unsettled her. It was the first real crack in her confident exterior. As Bradley walked back to his cruiser to finish up the paperwork, Karen shot Alex a withering glare. You think you're clever, don't you? Alex met her gaze evenly. No, Karen. I think I'm patient. She scoffed and turned on her heel, retreating back inside, but Alex knew this wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Alex knew filing the police report wouldn't magically solve the problem, But he also understood that in situations like this, paper trails mattered. The moment Karen had destroyed his charging station and tried to shift the blame onto him, she had made one critical mistake. She had underestimated him. She expected him to brush it off, maybe argue a little, but ultimately let it go. She was used to people bending under her passive-aggressive pressure, to neighbors who would rather avoid conflict than deal with her relentless tactics. But Alex wasn't one of those people. He had spent years in corporate finance, navigating power plays and manipulative games that made Karen's antics look amateurish in comparison. She thought she was controlling the narrative, but she had no idea what was coming. The next morning, as he sat at his desk reviewing the insurance claim he had filed for the destroyed charging station, he heard a sharp knock at his front door. He wasn't surprised. He had been expecting another move from her, but he hadn't expected her to send someone else to do her dirty work. When he opened the door, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a crisp gray suit stood on his porch. His demeanor was polished but cold, his eyes assessing as he held out a business card. "Mr. Carver, I presume." Alex took the card without glancing at it. "Depends on who's asking." The man smiled, but it was the type of smile meant to intimidate rather than reassure. "Jonathan Reeves. I represent the community's legal interests. I understand there's been an unfortunate situation between you and your neighbor, Mrs. Wilkins." Alex leaned against the doorframe, unimpressed. "If by unfortunate situation you mean her destroying my property, then yes, that would be correct." Reeves tilted his head slightly, as if measuring his words. "I'd like to propose a more amicable resolution. Mrs. Wilkins is willing to drop any further discussion about the matter if you agree to withdraw your police report and the insurance claim." Alex let out a short laugh, shaking his head. "Let me get this straight. You came all the way here to suggest that I drop my claim when she's the one who ran over my charging station. And after that, what? I'm supposed to pay for her bumper damage like a good little neighbor." Reeves didn't flinch. "Mr. Carver, these disputes have a way of escalating unnecessarily. I'm simply here to prevent that from happening." Alex's eyes narrowed slightly. "No, you're here to clean up Karen's mess because she's used to getting away with this kind of thing. But I don't operate like that, and I don't scare easily. So you can take whatever amicable resolution you're selling and go pitch it to someone else." Reeves held his composure, but Alex caught the flicker of irritation in his expression before he nodded, slipping his card back into his pocket. "Very well. I had hoped this could be resolved without unnecessary legal complications, but if that's your decision, I'll inform my client." "Do that," Alex said flatly, before shutting the door in his face. He wasn't naive. He knew Karen wouldn't stop here. This was just her testing the waters, seeing how easily he could be pressured. The fact that she had already brought in a lawyer so quickly told him one important thing: she was worried. And when people like Karen started to feel the ground shifting beneath them, they either backed down or doubled down. 2 days later, it became clear which route she had chosen. Alex stepped outside to get his mail and immediately noticed something off. His trash cans, which had been neatly placed by the curb the previous evening, were now knocked over, the contents spilling onto his driveway. Coffee grounds, shredded paper, food containers. It was a deliberate mess, not something caused by wind or an animal. His gut told him Karen had something to do with it, but without proof, there was nothing he could do. Then he saw the envelope tucked into his mailbox, marked with an official-looking letterhead. His irritation deepened as he opened it and scanned the contents. It was a formal complaint, claiming that it is improperly placed. Charging station had caused a safety hazard, and as a result, his property was now under review for potential violations. Alex exhaled slowly, gripping the letter tighter. He had anticipated retaliation, but he had underestimated just how quickly Karen would weaponize bureaucracy. The wording was vague, filled with language that implied his charging station had been an obstruction, despite the fact that it had been well within his property lines. The real issue, of course, was that Karen wasn't just trying to avoid paying for damages, she was trying to make him the guilty party. Later that evening, as he reviewed every document related to his home, he noticed something else. The property line records he had originally downloaded weeks ago now showed a discrepancy. It wasn't major, but it was just enough to suggest that a portion of his driveway, including the exact area where the charging station had been, was in a gray zone between private and community property. That wasn't how it had been listed before. His jaw tightened as he realized exactly what Karen had done. She had manipulated the system to make it look like his charging station had been illegally placed, giving her the leverage to push for official action against him. She hadn't just run over his property, she was trying to rewrite history to make it seem like he had never had the right to install it in the first place. Alex wasn't going to let that happen. Instead of reacting impulsively, he made his own calculated move. The next morning, he requested a certified copy of the original property survey from when he purchased the house, ensuring he had hard evidence that the charging station had been placed within the correct boundaries before the recent adjustment. He also hired an independent property assessor to conduct an emergency review of the land records, looking for any recent modifications. If Karen or someone working with her had tampered with the official records, he would have concrete proof. By the time he got home that evening, he already had a voicemail from the assessor confirming something he had suspected, but hoped wouldn't be true. His property boundary had been quietly altered in the digital database just 3 days prior. There was no legal justification for the change, no request from him as the homeowner, no formal petition that should have triggered it. It was a clear manipulation of the system, and he now had proof that someone had deliberately adjusted the records to weaken his position. And that changed everything. Karen had expected him to be passive, to get frustrated and eventually give up. But now she had escalated things into outright fraud, and Alex wasn't going to let that slide. When he called the property assessor back, his voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the steel beneath his words. "I want everything you found in writing. Every modification, every data change, every name attached to it. And I need it by tomorrow." Because now this wasn't just about a destroyed charging station or an insurance claim. Karen had made the mistake of thinking she was untouchable. But Alex was about to prove her very, very wrong. Alex had always known that conflicts like these weren't won through brute force or knee-jerk reactions, they were won through strategy, patience, and absolute precision. The moment he confirmed that the records of his property had been tampered with, he knew that Karen had overplayed her hand. People like her relied on intimidation, deception, and technical loopholes to get their way, but they rarely expected real resistance from someone who knew how to fight back properly. The following morning, Alex took every document he had: the original property records, the assessor's report detailing the unauthorized modifications, the certified land survey from when he purchased the house, and the photos of his charging station before and after the damage, and organized them into a meticulously structured file. He wasn't just collecting evidence, he was building a case. He had no doubt that Karen had used her connections to manipulate the system in her favor, but people like her always left a trail of inconsistencies, and he was going to expose every single one of them. His first move was to schedule a formal appointment with the local zoning and land management office. He wanted to speak directly with the officials responsible for handling property disputes, ensuring that the fraudulent modifications to his land records were flagged before they could be used against him in any legal proceeding. He also made sure to request a complete record of all changes made to his property within the last 6 months, including the names of any individuals who had submitted modification requests. If Karen had managed to push something through behind closed doors, he wanted a paper trail linking it back to her. When he arrived at the zoning office later that afternoon, the clerk at the front desk barely looked up as she asked for his documents. Alex, knowing how bureaucracy worked, remained polite but firm, making it clear that he wasn't there for a simple inquiry, he was there for a full investigation into property fraud. That got her attention. Within minutes, a supervisor was called in, and Alex was led to a private office where he laid out his case in painstaking detail. The supervisor, an older man with graying hair and deep lines of exhaustion around his eyes, listened in silence as Alex presented his findings. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured but serious. "This kind of tampering isn't common, but it's not unheard of," he admitted, flipping through the documents. "Most of the time it's a clerical error. But from what you're showing me, this doesn't look like a mistake, it looks deliberate." Alex leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Then I assume there's a formal process for escalating this." "There is," the supervisor said slowly, "but I need to be upfront with you. If this was done by someone with influence, they're going to push back hard the moment we start digging into it. Alex met his gaze without hesitation. Let them. The supervisor exhaled, nodding slightly before gathering the documents into a neat stack. I'll file an official review today. It'll take a few days to go through, but if we find evidence that someone knowingly altered these records without cause, there will be consequences. Alex thanked him and left the office feeling a rare sense of satisfaction. This wasn't just about proving Karen wrong anymore. It was about holding her accountable in a way she had never experienced before. He knew she had expected him to crumble under the weight of bureaucracy, but she had failed to recognize one crucial detail: he thrived under pressure. But Karen wasn't going to just sit back and wait for the system to catch up with her. By the time Alex returned home, he noticed an immediate shift in the atmosphere of the neighborhood. Where before his interactions with most neighbors had been neutral or polite, now there was a distinct chill in the air. He could feel the eyes on him, the way conversations would stop or quiet down whenever he walked past. Karen had gone on the offensive. That evening, a notice was posted on his door, stamped with an official-looking seal. He recognized the format instantly. It was a formal citation for a violation of community guidelines, claiming that his damaged charging station was a safety hazard that needed to be removed immediately. The irony of the situation almost made him laugh. Karen had destroyed his property and then had the audacity to claim that he was the one creating a problem by leaving the wreckage behind. He had half a mind to tear the notice down and throw it away, but he knew better than that. Every move she made was designed to force him into reacting emotionally. Instead of playing into her hands, he documented the citation, filed it alongside his existing evidence, and began drafting his own counter-complaint. But the real surprise came the next morning when he received an unexpected visit from a property inspector. The man, dressed in a plain button-down shirt and carrying a clipboard, introduced himself as part of the local Housing Compliance Board. I received a report about potential unauthorized modifications to your property, he said, glancing around the driveway with the air of someone who had already made up his mind before arriving. Alex's jaw tightened. Let me guess, my neighbor called this in. The inspector didn't answer directly, but his silence said enough. I just need to conduct a routine inspection. Shouldn't take long. Alex stepped aside, watching as the man walked around his property, jotting down notes, taking pictures, and deliberately lingering around the area where his charging station had once stood. The entire thing felt staged, as if Karen had orchestrated it in an attempt to create a manufactured violation. When the inspector finally finished, he closed his clipboard with a snap. I'll be filing my report with the board. If there are any compliance issues, you'll receive an official notice. Alex crossed his arms. And if there aren't any issues, the inspector gave him a tight-lipped smile. Then there won't be a problem. Alex watched him leave, his mind already running through every possible countermeasure. Karen was using every tool at her disposal: bureaucratic complaints, social pressure from the neighbors, and now official inspections to make his life as difficult as possible. She wanted him frustrated. She wanted him to lash out. She wanted him to break first. But Alex wasn't going to break. Instead, he doubled down on his approach. He started reaching out to neighbors who had previously clashed with Karen, carefully choosing those who had no reason to support her. He learned about past incidents where she had manipulated rules to her advantage, bullied homeowners into compliance, and even pushed people to move away rather than deal with her harassment. And most importantly, he found someone willing to talk about it publicly. A former resident, who had moved out just 6 months earlier, provided a signed statement detailing how Karen had falsified complaints against them, used similar tactics to create legal pressure, and had directly benefited from the sale of their home to one of her associates. It was the final piece Alex needed. Now, Karen wasn't just a petty neighbor trying to cause problems. She was part of a pattern of systematic abuse, and he was going to make damn sure everyone knew it. Alex had always believed that people like Karen eventually revealed their true nature when backed into a corner. The problem was that when people like her felt the walls closing in, they didn't retreat, they lashed out. Over the past week, she had escalated her attacks from passive-aggressive complaints to outright manipulation of official records, and now that she had been confronted with evidence of her fraudulent behavior, he knew she wouldn't simply admit defeat and walk away. She had invested too much effort into making his life miserable, and someone like Karen didn't just stop. She would find another way to exert control, another way to claw back the power she had lost. And sure enough, by the time Alex received the official report from the zoning office confirming that his property records had been unlawfully altered, he already sensed the shift in Karen's strategy. It started with the neighbors. The same people who had previously given him polite nods or casual greetings now avoided eye contact when he passed. Conversations that had once been open and friendly now fell into hushed whispers when he walked by. He wasn't surprised. Karen had been working tirelessly behind the scenes, spinning a narrative in which he was the problem, he was the troublemaker, he was the outsider disturbing the peace of their quiet community. And while some saw through her manipulations, others were more than willing to believe whatever version of reality she carefully crafted for them. He saw it in the way some of the residents looked at him with veiled disapproval, in the way certain cars slowed down just a little too much when passing by his driveway, as if they were inspecting him rather than his property. Then came the second wave. Official notices started appearing in his mailbox, citing new violations, claims that his landscaping wasn't up to code, that his fence height exceeded the permitted limit, that his damaged charging station was a hazard that required immediate removal at his own expense. Each notice was carefully worded to imply legal consequences if he failed to comply, each one carrying the subtle but unmistakable fingerprint of Karen's interference. And while Alex had already taken the necessary legal steps to dispute her fraudulent property modifications, these new tactics were meant to wear him down, to frustrate him, to force him into submission through sheer exhaustion. But Karen had made one crucial mistake. She had assumed that her petty bureaucratic warfare would break him. What she failed to realize was that Alex had no intention of playing defense anymore. Instead of reacting, instead of letting anger dictate his next moves, he went on the offensive. The first thing he did was escalate the case beyond local jurisdiction. With the official findings from the zoning office in hand, he filed a formal complaint with the state regulatory board overseeing land and property disputes. This was no longer just a neighborhood issue, it was now an official investigation, one that Karen wouldn't be able to manipulate as easily. He ensured that the complaint included the full timeline of events, from the initial property record tampering to the manufactured violations she had weaponized against him. He wasn't just challenging her actions, he was exposing a pattern of abuse that went beyond his own experience, one that implicated multiple instances of past misconduct. Then he brought the insurance companies into the fight. He had already filed a claim for the damage to his charging station, but now he took it a step further. Using the evidence of Karen's intentional destruction of property, he submitted an additional claim citing malicious interference and financial damages incurred as a result of her fraudulent activities. This triggered a review process that required Karen to provide her own statement, forcing her to either admit to the damage or attempt to lie her way through a legally binding investigation. Either way, it meant more scrutiny, more pressure, more attention that she couldn't afford. And then there was the final move, the one Karen never saw coming. Alex had spent days gathering information from former residents, speaking with people who had once lived in the neighborhood but had been forced out due to similar harassment tactics. Some had been subjected to relentless fines, others had dealt with fabricated complaints, and a few had even sold their homes under duress after facing consistent, targeted pressure from Karen and her associates. It was a pattern of manipulation, coercion, and systematic abuse of authority, and now Alex had the proof he needed to bring it to light in the most public way possible. The next morning, Karen received a formal letter, one that wasn't from the neighborhood association, the zoning office, or even Alex himself. It was a subpoena ordering her to provide testimony in an official review of the property management practices that had taken place under her influence. The complaint wasn't just about Alex anymore, it had now expanded into a full-scale legal inquiry into past fraudulent activity within the community. And just like that, the power she had wielded so recklessly was now being turned against her. Karen's reaction was immediate. She stormed over to Alex's house that evening, banging on his door with enough force to rattle the frame. When he finally opened it, she was already mid-sentence, her voice a furious, barely contained snarl. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Alex met her gaze with infuriating calm. "Holding you accountable." Karen's face twisted in rage. "You have no idea what you're getting yourself into." He folded his arms. "No, Karen. You have no idea what you've gotten yourself into. I suggest you get a lawyer. You're going to need one." For the first time since this ordeal had begun, Karen didn't have a quick retort, didn't have a smug comment, didn't have control over the conversation. Her fingers curled into fists at her sides, her breathing was uneven, her eyes filled with something that wasn't just anger, it was fear. And Alex had no intention of letting up. Over the next several days, as the legal process began unfolding, the tense energy in the neighborhood shifted again. Some residents, realizing that Karen's reign of control was slipping, began distancing themselves from her. Others, those who had been too afraid to speak up before, quietly reached out to Alex with their own stories, providing him with even more ammunition against her. The pressure was mounting, and Karen knew it. She had spent years cultivating an illusion of invulnerability, carefully ensuring that no one ever challenged her authority. But now, she was watching everything she had built collapse around her. And for the first time, she had no way to stop it. Karen had always operated under the assumption that no one would ever push back hard enough to stop her. She had spent years perfecting the art of manipulation, bending rules just enough to avoid serious consequences, using social pressure and bureaucratic red tape as weapons to keep others in check. But now, for the first time, she was no longer in control of the situation. The legal investigation had been set in motion, and no amount of backpedaling or under-the-table deals could make it go away. Alex could see the shift in her demeanor every time they crossed paths. Where she had once carried herself with smug superiority, now there was something else behind her eyes, something sharp and desperate. She no longer walked with the same arrogant confidence, no longer went out of her way to flaunt her authority in front of the neighbors. Instead, she had grown erratic, lashing out at those who no longer supported her, avoiding eye contact when confronted with whispers of the legal trouble she now faced. She had tried to retaliate, of course, tried filing counterclaims against Alex, tried calling in whatever favors she still had left within the local governance structure, but none of it worked. Every avenue she had once relied on had been severed, every door she once controlled had been slammed shut in her face. The final breaking point came on a crisp Wednesday morning. Alex had just finished a conference call for work when he heard the knock at his door. This time, it wasn't Karen standing outside. It was two plainclothes investigators from the state attorney's office, holding documents that carried far more weight than any of Karen's petty neighborhood citations. "Mr. Carver," one of them asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Alex nodded. "That's me. We'd like to ask you a few questions regarding your formal complaint against Karen Wilkins and the fraudulent property modifications filed under her oversight." Alex stepped aside, letting them in, feeling a quiet sense of satisfaction settle in his chest. This wasn't just about his charging station anymore. It wasn't just about the petty harassment or the underhanded tactics. This was about holding someone accountable who had spent far too long getting away with things she had no right to get away with. For the next 2 hours, he laid out everything he had gathered. The evidence of the falsified property records, the intimidation tactics she had used against previous homeowners, the fabricated violations meant to push people out, and the financial benefits she had reaped from those who had been forced to sell their homes under duress. He provided witness statements, documented complaints from former residents, and the detailed findings from the zoning office proving that the changes to his own property records had been manipulated with intent. When the investigators finally closed their folders and stood to leave, one of them offered him a firm nod. This is more than enough to move forward. 3 days later, Karen was served with an official notice of legal proceedings against her. The reaction from the neighborhood was immediate. Some people pretended they had never supported her, distancing themselves as quickly as possible. Others were genuinely shocked, not realizing just how deep her corruption had run. A few, the ones who had suffered under her reign the longest, were quietly relieved, knowing that they no longer had to live under the constant threat of her manufactured complaints and vindictive enforcement of rules she had twisted to serve her own interests. Karen, however, did not go quietly. She tried to turn the situation back on Alex, tried to frame herself as the victim of a vendetta, claiming that she had only ever acted in the best interest of the community. She insisted that Alex had misconstrued the facts, that he had blown things out of proportion, that she was being unfairly targeted. But the evidence was undeniable, and with the weight of a formal state-level investigation pressing down on her, her usual tactics of deception and deflection simply weren't enough. On the day of her hearing, Alex watched from a distance as she walked toward the courthouse, her usual self-assured expression replaced with something hollow and strained. There were no reporters, no flashing cameras, no dramatic public downfall, just a quiet, inevitable collapse of the illusion of power she had carefully constructed for herself. As he stood there, he realized something. Karen hadn't lost because she had finally been caught. She had lost because she had never expected someone like him to fight back as methodically as she had attacked. And that was why she had never stood a chance. In the days following Karen's hearing, the neighborhood took on a strange, almost eerie stillness. The same people who had once eagerly whispered about Alex behind his back now avoided discussing the situation altogether, as if acknowledging Karen's downfall would somehow implicate them in their previous silence. Others, those who had suffered under her control for years, allowed themselves cautious moments of relief, but they, too, seemed hesitant to celebrate openly. It was as if the community had been so conditioned to exist under her unrelenting scrutiny that even with her power dismantled, they struggled to adjust to the idea of life without her. Karen, of course, refused to acknowledge the reality of her situation. In the immediate aftermath of the legal proceedings, she attempted to maintain the appearance of control, going about her daily routines with forced normalcy, as if pretending nothing had changed could somehow undo the consequences of her actions. But as the days stretched into weeks, the cracks in her carefully maintained facade became impossible to ignore. The whispers didn't stop, the isolation didn't fade, and the weight of the investigation only grew heavier. Then, one morning, just under a month after the official case against her had been filed, Karen Wilkins disappeared. It wasn't dramatic, no moving vans, no formal goodbyes, no last-ditch attempts at redemption. One night, her lights were on, her car parked in the driveway as usual. By the next morning, the house was empty. The blinds were drawn, the mailbox was cleared out, and the ever-present SUV that had once been a symbol of her dominance over the neighborhood was gone. Some speculated that she had fled before the full weight of legal consequences could come crashing down on her. Others claimed she had been forced out by the same system she had once manipulated so skillfully. But no one truly knew, and more importantly, no one particularly cared to find out. Her house sat vacant for weeks before it was quietly listed for sale. No one in the neighborhood knew, or at least no one admitted to knowing where she had gone, and for the first time in years, there was no self-appointed enforcer standing watch over every minor infraction, no lurking presence ready to twist community rules for personal gain. There was only silence, an absence that was as unsettling as it was liberating. Alex, however, had no intention of fading into that silence. He hadn't fought this battle just to see things return to the same complacent state that had allowed Karen's corruption to thrive in the first place. So when the opportunity arose to attend a formal meeting regarding policy revisions and ethical oversight within the community's governing board, he made sure to be there. The meeting itself was uneventful, dull, even filled with legal jargon and administrative discussions that made it clear how little the board had ever expected actual pushback from its residents. But when Alex stood to speak, the room shifted. Some leaned forward, waiting for a confrontation. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to engage in anything that might further disturb the fragile balance that had been restored since Karen's departure. But Alex wasn't there to provoke. He was there to ensure that what had happened to him, to the former residents who had been forced out, would never happen again. Rules exist to maintain order, not to be used as weapons against the people they're supposed to protect, he said, his voice calm but firm. What happened with Karen Wilkins wasn't an accident, and it wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a direct result of a system that gave one person too much unchecked power. And if we don't change how things are run, if we don't put safeguards in place to prevent something like this from happening again, then we're all just waiting for the next Karen to show up. For the first time since the meeting had started, no one spoke. And then, slowly, a voice from the back of the room broke the silence. He's right. It was an older man, one of the longest-standing residents in the community. Then, another voice joined in agreement, and another, and another. By the time the meeting adjourned, the first steps toward implementing actual oversight, transparency, and accountability had been set in motion. It wasn't an immediate transformation, and it certainly wasn't a perfect one. But it was a start. Alex walked out of that meeting knowing that he had done more than just protect himself. He had changed something fundamental about the way things worked in that neighborhood. And that, more than anything, was what real victory looked like. That night, as he sat on his porch, looking out at the quiet street that had once been a battlefield, he allowed himself a rare moment of peace. The wreckage of his charging station had long since been cleared away, and a brand new model stood in its place, upgraded and unshakable. This time there would be no one left to destroy it.